There's a moment when even the most patriotic CEOs realize that loyalty to country becomes secondary to fiduciary duty to shareholders. That moment came when American political volatility made Canadian stability worth more than American market access. I've been studying corporate behavior and political economy for decades, and I can tell you that what we're witnessing represents something unprecedented in American business history. Not just because companies are relocating operations internationally, which has always happened for economic reasons, but because they're fleeing American political instability in favor of foreign institutional predictability. When capitalism itself concludes that America is bad for business, we've crossed a line that may be impossible to uncross. The public story, to the extent that it's been covered at all, focuses on routine business expansion and strategic diversification. Corporate press releases speak diplomatically about exploring new markets and optimizing operational efficiency. But what's actually happening in boardrooms across America is far more consequential and far more damning than any public relations language suggests. What's happening is a systematic evaluation of whether American political chaos has made American operations untenable for long-term business planning. The psychological moment when this calculation shifted was subtle but decisive. It came when senior executives realized they were spending more time and resources managing political risk than they were spending on actual business development. When regulatory frameworks become unpredictable, when trade policies change overnight via social media, when tax structures become subject to sudden revision based on political messaging needs, business planning becomes impossible. Let me walk you through how this corporate awakening developed because it reveals important truths about the relationship between institutional stability and business confidence. American companies had always assumed that operating in their home market provided certain advantages: familiarity with regulations, proximity to decision makers, cultural alignment with customer bases, and patriotic goodwill that had value in both marketing and government relations. When those advantages began to be outweighed by the costs of political volatility, the entire calculation changed. Companies discovered that familiarity with regulations was meaningless when regulations could change without warning. Proximity to decision makers became a liability when decision-making processes became chaotic. Cultural alignment with customer bases mattered less when business operations were constantly disrupted by political theater. The manufacturing sector provides perhaps the clearest example of how this shift played out in practice. Companies that had built their business models around American production discovered that supply chain disruptions caused by trade policy uncertainty were more costly than any labor or regulatory advantages that domestic operations provided. When tariffs can appear overnight, when trade relationships can be redefined via Twitter, when international agreements can be abandoned without consultation, manufacturing planning becomes impossible. Canadian operations offered something that American operations no longer could: predictability. Canadian trade policy doesn't change direction based on social media outbursts. Canadian regulatory frameworks maintain consistency across electoral transitions. Canadian tax policy operates through established legislative processes rather than arbitrary executive decisions. For companies that need to plan investments over decades, these qualities weren't just preferable, they were essential. The financial services sector followed similar patterns, but with even more dramatic implications. Banks and investment firms require regulatory certainty to make the long-term commitments that underpin modern finance. When American financial regulation became subject to sudden policy reversals and regulatory capture by political appointees, financial institutions began moving critical operations to jurisdictions where regulatory frameworks were more stable. Canada's financial regulatory system wasn't necessarily superior to America's in terms of innovation or flexibility, but it was predictable. Financial institutions could make multi-year compliance investments with confidence that the regulatory framework would remain recognizable across electoral cycles. That predictability became worth more than any temporary competitive advantages that American markets might have provided. The technology sector experienced perhaps the most complex version of this dynamic. Tech companies depend heavily on international talent, global supply chains, and regulatory frameworks that support innovation across borders. When American immigration policy became chaotic, when international technology cooperation became subject to sudden political restrictions, when regulatory approaches to technology shifted dramatically based on partisan political calculations, tech companies began looking elsewhere. Canadian technology policy wasn't perfect from any individual company's perspective, but it was consistent. Companies could build long-term research and development strategies without worrying that political changes would suddenly make their investments worthless or their international partnerships illegal. For an industry that operates on long development cycles and requires stable international relationships, consistency became the determining factor. What makes this corporate exodus particularly devastating for American economic competitiveness is how it's concentrated among exactly the industries that drive long-term economic growth: high-value manufacturing, advanced financial services, technology development. These are the sectors that create good jobs, generate tax revenues, and anchor economic ecosystems. When these industries relocate to escape political instability, they take their entire economic ecosystems with them. The human dimension of this story is particularly tragic because it affects the very workers that political rhetoric claims to protect. When companies relocate operations to escape American political volatility, American workers don't get the option to relocate with them. They get layoffs, plant closures, and the slow dissolution of the economic communities that their families had built their lives around. Corporate executives making these relocation decisions aren't doing so out of hostility toward American workers or lack of patriotic sentiment. They're doing so because their fiduciary duty to shareholders requires them to operate where business can be conducted predictably. When political chaos makes predictable business operations impossible in America, that duty requires them to look elsewhere. Canadian officials understood this dynamic and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of trying to compete with American market size or resources, they offered what American markets could no longer provide: institutional boringness, boring tax policy, boring regulatory frameworks, boring trade relationships. For business planning purposes, boring became beautiful. The investment implications of this corporate migration extend far beyond any individual company or sector. When businesses relocate to escape political instability, they take their capital investments, their high-skilled employment, and their innovation ecosystems with them. Cities and regions that had built their identities around major corporate headquarters discover that corporate loyalty has limits when institutional stability disappears. From a global competitiveness perspective, this represents a strategic disaster for American economic leadership. The advantage that America had maintained in attracting international business investment was based not just on market size, but on institutional predictability. When that predictability disappeared, market size alone couldn't compensate for the uncertainty costs that political volatility imposed on business operations. The irony is that much of the political rhetoric driving this corporate exodus was supposedly designed to put American business interests first. But business interests aren't just about short-term regulatory relief or temporary tax advantages. They're about the ability to plan, invest, and operate with confidence that the rules governing business operations will remain recognizable over time. When political leaders treat business regulation as a tool for political messaging rather than economic development, when trade policy becomes subject to personal grievances rather than strategic planning, when tax policy gets redesigned to serve electoral rather than economic goals, they're not putting business first. They're making business impossible. Canadian policymakers recognized this disconnect and exploited it brilliantly. They offered American companies something that American politics could no longer provide: the ability to focus on business rather than politics. When regulatory compliance becomes predictable, when trade relationships remain stable, when tax policy operates through established processes, companies can devote their resources to innovation and growth rather than political risk management. The long-term implications of this corporate exodus are still unfolding, but they're already visible in employment patterns, tax revenues, and regional economic development. Communities that had built their prosperity around major corporate operations are discovering how quickly that prosperity can evaporate when the corporations decide that political stability is worth more than geographical proximity. What's particularly sobering about this trend is how it demonstrates the limits of political rhetoric in the face of economic reality. Companies don't respond to speeches about putting America first when the policies accompanying those speeches make American operations more difficult. They respond to the actual costs and benefits of operating in different jurisdictions, and when those calculations favor foreign operations, patriotic sentiment becomes irrelevant. The tragedy here is how avoidable this entire crisis was. The institutional frameworks for maintaining business confidence weren't exotic or impossible to preserve. They just required the kind of political discipline that prioritizes long-term economic health over short-term political advantage. Instead of that discipline, American politics chose chaos, and American business responded by choosing predictability elsewhere. As this corporate migration continues, what becomes clear is that economic nationalism and institutional chaos are fundamentally incompatible. You can't make America great again by making American institutions unreliable. You can't bring business back by making business planning impossible. When those contradictions become apparent, business votes with its feet, and those votes are being counted in Canadian corporate headquarters. For observers trying to understand how economic power shifts in a globalized world, the American corporate exodus offers important lessons about the relationship between political stability and business confidence. When institutions become unreliable, even domestic businesses begin looking elsewhere. And once that migration begins, reversing it requires not just policy changes, but institutional restoration that may take decades to achieve. The most damning aspect of this entire episode is what it reveals about the gap between political promises and economic delivery. American workers were told that political disruption would bring their jobs back. Instead, political disruption drove their employers away. They were told that chaos would serve their interests. Instead, chaos served the interests of foreign competitors who offered what American politics could not: the stable institutional environment that modern business requires. When American capitalism concludes that America is bad for business, it's not just an indictment of specific policies or leaders. It's a verdict on the entire approach to governance that treats institutions as disposable rather than foundational. And once that verdict is rendered by the market itself, reversing it becomes exponentially more difficult than preventing it would have been.